On our fifth anniversary, my husband Eddie left me stranded at our romantic dinner table with a note saying he was leaving me for my sister Callie. But as his entire family gathered the next morning to celebrate his freedom, I walked in with a manila envelope that made his mother faint, his father go silent, and Eddie himself begged me not to speak another word, because inside those papers was proof that the Castellano family fortune was built on lies, and I held the power to destroy everything they'd spent decades hiding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table in the Castellano family estate stretched before me like a battlefield, surrounded by faces that had once welcomed me as family but now stared at me with barely concealed contempt. Eddie's mother, Miranda Castellano, sat rigid in her designer suit, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching her pearls as if they could shield her from what was coming. His father, John Castellano Sr., maintained his usual stoic expression, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his coffee cup. Eddie himself wouldn't even look at me, his cowardly eyes fixed on the Persian rug beneath his Italian leather shoes. "Kendra," Miranda's voice dripped with the condescension I'd grown to despise over 5 years of marriage. "I think you've caused enough drama for one weekend. Perhaps it's time you accepted reality and moved on with whatever dignity you have left." I smiled, feeling the weight of the manila envelope in my hands like a weapon finally ready to be drawn. "Oh, Miranda, I couldn't agree more. It's definitely time for some reality." "And dignity?" I laughed, the sound echoing through their precious family room filled with stolen artifacts and blood money. Let's talk about dignity. 24 hours earlier, I had been Kendra Walsh Castellano, the devoted wife who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. I had spent weeks planning our anniversary dinner at Rosewood Manor, the exclusive restaurant where Eddie had proposed 5 years ago. I'd worn the emerald dress he claimed was his favorite, arranged for our usual table overlooking the garden, and even ordered the vintage champagne we'd shared on our wedding night. But Eddie never came. Instead, a waiter approached my table with a sealed envelope, his face filled with the kind of pity reserved for public humiliation. Inside was a handwritten note in Eddie's familiar scrawl. "Kendra, I can't pretend anymore. Callie and I have been in love for 2 years. We're leaving together tonight. Don't try to find us. The marriage is over. E." I sat there for 30 minutes, watching other couples enjoy their romantic evenings, while I processed the fact that my husband had abandoned me on our anniversary for my own sister. The same sister who had been living in our guest house for the past year, the one I'd helped through her divorce, the one who'd cried on my shoulder about being alone. The drive home was a blur of rage and disbelief. Our house, the Victorian mansion Eddie's family had bought us as a wedding gift, felt like a mausoleum of broken promises. Callie's belongings were gone from the guest house. Eddie's closet was half empty. They had planned this, executed it with precision, and left me to discover the wreckage alone. The next morning, I woke to the sound of cars in our driveway. Through the bedroom window, I watched the Castellano family arrive for what I later learned was their impromptu celebration brunch. Miranda stepped out of her silver Mercedes like a queen surveying her domain. John Sr. emerged from his black Bentley, adjusting his tie with the same authoritative gesture I'd seen Eddie inherit. Even Eddie's younger brother Ash was there, probably called in to witness what they assumed would be my final humiliation. They had keys, of course. The Castellano family had keys to everything they considered theirs, including the house where I still legally lived. I could hear them downstairs, their voices carrying the unmistakable tone of victory. Miranda was already discussing redecorating and removing traces of that unfortunate chapter. John Sr. was talking about property transfers and, quote, clean breaks. They thought I was beaten. They thought Eddie's abandonment had broken me completely, leaving me a powerless, heartbroken woman who would quietly disappear from their lives with whatever scraps they decided to throw me. They had no idea that abandoning me was the biggest mistake the Castellano family had ever made. Because, you see, for the past 2 years, while my husband was having an affair with my sister, I had been conducting my own investigation. Not into his infidelity. I had been blissfully unaware of that betrayal. No, I had been investigating something far more dangerous to the Castellano empire. The truth about how they'd built their fortune. My background wasn't just decorative, despite what the Castellanos believed. While they saw me as the pretty art history major Eddie had plucked from obscurity, my degree had actually been in forensic accounting with a specialization in art fraud investigation. My hobby of researching antique provenance wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was my profession, one I'd kept quiet about to avoid overshadowing Eddie's fragile ego. When I first entered the Castellano mansion as Eddie's girlfriend, I'd been struck by their incredible art collection. Paintings worth millions, sculptures that belonged in museums, artifacts that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Miranda loved to boast about their family collection, passed down through generations of shrewd investments and lucky acquisitions. But my trained eye had begun noticing inconsistencies. Signatures that didn't quite match authenticated works, provenance documents with subtle irregularities. Most telling of all, pieces that I recognized from FBI databases of stolen art, works that had been lost during World War II, items that had mysteriously vanished from museums, paintings that had disappeared from private collections under suspicious circumstances. The Castellano fortune wasn't built on legitimate business ventures, as they claimed. It was built on art theft, fraud, and money laundering, spanning 3 generations. Every painting on their walls, every sculpture in their garden, every investment piece in their climate-controlled vault was either stolen, forged, or purchased with dirty money. And I had spent 2 years meticulously documenting every single piece. So when I walked into that family meeting, manila envelope in hand, I wasn't the broken, abandoned wife they expected to see. I was a forensic accountant with enough evidence to destroy not just their reputation, but their freedom. The FBI had been very interested in my preliminary findings, particularly when I'd connected several pieces in the Castellano collection to unsolved cases dating back decades. Before we discuss redecorating, I said, placing the envelope on the mahogany table with deliberate precision, I think we should talk about this Monet hanging behind you, Miranda. The one that was stolen from the Rothschild estate in 1943. Or perhaps we should discuss the Picasso in John's study, the one that disappeared from the Barcelona Museum of Modern Art in 1987. The room went silent. Miranda's face drained of color. John Sr.'s coffee cup trembled against its saucer. Ash looked confused, but Eddie's expression told me everything I needed to know. He was aware of at least some of his family's crimes. That's ridiculous, Miranda stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Those are family pieces, inherited. From Grandfather Sal's collection, yes, I know the story, I interrupted, opening the envelope. The same Grandfather Sal, who worked as a, quote, procurement specialist for various European collectors during and after World War II. Funny how his procurement records, which I found in your vault, John, don't match the ownership papers you've been showing insurance companies for decades. I pulled out the first photograph, a clear image of their Monet alongside the FBI's documentation of its theft. Eddie abandoned me last night, thinking he was free to start a new life with my sister. But what he didn't realize is that by betraying me, he unleashed someone who no longer has any reason to protect this family's secrets. The papers that would silence the Castellano family weren't just evidence. They were 3 generations of carefully hidden crimes, documented with forensic precision and already shared with federal investigators. Eddie thought abandoning me would be his liberation. Instead, it became his family's downfall. And this was just the beginning of their reckoning. 5 years ago, I was a different person entirely. Fresh out of graduate school with my master's in forensic accounting, I was working for a small firm in downtown Chicago that specialized in insurance fraud investigations. My life was simple, predictable, and entirely my own. I had a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, a rescue cat named Dexter, and dreams of eventually working for the FBI's art crime team. That crisp October morning when I first met Eddie Castellano at the Art Institute of Chicago, I was there for work, not pleasure. Our firm had been hired to investigate a suspicious insurance claim involving a supposedly damaged Renaissance painting. I was photographing the piece when I noticed him, tall, impeccably dressed, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He was standing in front of a Monet, but his attention was clearly focused on me. "You're either an art expert or an insurance investigator," he said, approaching with a confidence that should have been my first warning sign. The way you're documenting that piece suggests the latter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was charmed by his directness and impressed by his knowledge. How did you know? My family collects, he replied with a smile that made my stomach flutter. I've seen that look before. The professional assessment, the careful documentation. You're looking for inconsistencies, aren't you? We talked for 2 hours. Eddie was brilliant, well-traveled, and surprisingly knowledgeable about art authentication. He told me his family had been collectors for generations, that he'd grown up surrounded by masterpieces, and had developed an eye for genuine versus fake. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes without hesitation. Our first date was at Alinea, the kind of restaurant I'd only read about in magazines. Eddie ordered wine that cost more than my monthly rent, and talked about art, with the passion of someone who truly understood its value. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, seemed genuinely interested in forensic accounting, and made me feel like my expertise was fascinating rather than boring. Most people think fraud investigation is tedious, I told him over dessert. Most people don't understand that every piece of art has a story, he replied. And sometimes those stories aren't what they appear to be. Your work is like detective work, isn't it? Uncovering the truth behind beautiful lies. The irony of those words would haunt me later. Our courtship was a whirlwind of cultural events, exclusive restaurants, and weekend trips to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. Eddie introduced me to opera, took me to gallery openings where I rubbed shoulders with artists whose work I'd only seen in textbooks. He bought me books on art history, jewelry that complemented my professional wardrobe, and experiences that expanded my world in ways I'd never imagined. 6 months in, he brought me to the family estate for the first time. The Castellano mansion in Lake Forest was breathtaking, a sprawling Tudor revival home set on 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. But it was the art collection that left me speechless. Room after room of museum-quality pieces, each one more stunning than the last. "This is incredible," I whispered, standing in their main gallery before what appeared to be an authentic Van Gogh. "Your family must have incredible connections in the art world." Miranda Castellano materialized beside us like a proud peacock, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer dress impeccable despite being at home. "The Castellano collection spans 4 generations, dear. We have an eye for exceptional pieces and the resources to acquire them when they become available." John Sr. joined us, his presence commanding even in casual clothes. My grandfather Sal started the collection during his travels in Europe after the war. He had remarkable opportunities to acquire pieces from families who needed to liquidate quickly. Even then, something about that phrasing bothered me. Families who needed to liquidate quickly. But I was so smitten with Eddie, so overwhelmed by their wealth and sophistication, that I pushed my professional instincts aside. The proposal came 8 months later, during a private tour of the Metropolitan Museum after hours, a privilege that Eddie's family connections had arranged. Surrounded by priceless art in the Egyptian wing, he got down on one knee and presented a ring that took my breath away. A 3-carat emerald surrounded by diamonds, set in platinum, that seemed to glow under the museum's subtle lighting. "It's been in my family for 3 generations, he told me as he slipped it onto my finger. My great-grandmother wore it when she married grandfather Sal in 1952. She always said it would find its way to the right woman when the time came." I was too emotional to notice that the setting looked far too modern for 1952, or that the emerald had a particular clarity that suggested recent cutting. Love made me blind to details that my professional training should have caught immediately. Our wedding was the event of the season in Lake Forest society. The ceremony took place in the estate's gardens, with the reception in a white silk pavilion that Miranda had imported from France for the occasion. 200 guests dined on cuisine, prepared by James Beard Award winners, while a string quartet played compositions that had once entertained European royalty. I felt like Cinderella, completely transformed from the girl who'd grown up in a middle-class family in Ohio to someone who belonged in this rarefied world. My parents were overwhelmed by the grandeur, my sister Callie was wide-eyed with envy, and I was so happy I could barely contain it. The first year of marriage was blissful in ways I'd never imagined possible. Eddie encouraged me to leave my firm and start my own consulting practice, offering to provide the startup funding and connections I'd need to attract high-end clients. The Castellano name opened doors I never could have opened alone, and soon I was working with insurance companies and private collectors on cases involving 7- and 8-figure art pieces. But Eddie was subtle in his suggestions about which cases to take and which to decline. When a potential client approached me about investigating the provenance of several works that had been acquired during estate liquidations in the 1940s, Eddie gently discouraged me from taking the case. "Those post-war acquisitions can be incredibly complex," he said over dinner. "Documentation was often incomplete. Ownership transfers were rushed. You might spend months investigating only to find that the trail goes cold. Wouldn't your time be better spent on more straightforward cases?" I trusted his judgment completely. After all, his family had been navigating the art world for generations. If Eddie thought a case was too complicated or risky, I deferred to his expertise. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he managed my career, steering me away from anything that might lead me too close to the truth about his family's collection. Every suggestion was wrapped in concern for my success, every redirect framed as protecting my reputation. He was so skillful in his manipulation that I never realized I was being controlled. The second year brought subtle changes. Eddie started traveling more frequently for business, though his explanations about what business were always vague. Miranda became more involved in our social calendar, hosting dinners and events where I was expected to play the perfect daughter-in-law. John Sr. began including me in conversations about family legacy and the importance of protecting what previous generations had built. It was during one of these family dinners that I first noticed something odd about one of their paintings, a small Renoir in the dining room that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. But when I mentioned it to Eddie later, he laughed it off. "All Renoirs look similar after a while," he said. "That's why he was so commercially successful. He found a style that worked and repeated it endlessly, but my training wouldn't let it go entirely. That nagging feeling that I'd seen the piece before kept surfacing, especially during family gatherings when I found myself studying it more closely. The brushwork was unmistakably Renoir, but something about the subject's expression seemed different from the reproduction I thought I remembered. It would be 3 more years before I understood why that painting looked so familiar, and by then the truth about the Castellano family fortune would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married and the life we'd built together. By our 3rd year of marriage, I had seamlessly integrated into the Castellano family's carefully orchestrated world. From the outside, we were the picture of success, the wealthy art collector's son and his brilliant wife, the perfect power couple who graced charity galas and museum board meetings with equal elegance. But perfection, I was learning, required constant maintenance. Yua's eyes, every aspect of our lives was curated with the precision of a museum exhibition. Our social calendar was managed by Miranda, who had appointed herself the architect of our public image. Tuesday evenings were reserved for the Art Institute's Young Patrons Circle, where Eddie and I would mingle with other couples our age who collected pieces worth more than most people's homes. Thursday nights belonged to the Chicago Symphony's donor events, where John Sr. served on the board and expected our attendance as a show of family unity. "Image is everything in our world, dear," Miranda would remind me as she selected my wardrobe for these events. "People need to see that the Castellano family maintains the highest standards in every aspect of our lives." I had come to understand that being a Castellano wife meant being a living advertisement for the family's sophistication and success. My appearance, my conversation, even my professional achievements were all reflections on their reputation. It was a responsibility I had initially embraced with enthusiasm, grateful to be part of something so grand and established. Our home became a showcase for entertaining. The Victorian mansion that had once felt overwhelming now served as the perfect backdrop for intimate dinner parties, with art dealers, museum curators, and wealthy collectors. I learned to plan menus that complemented the artwork in each room, to arrange seating charts that facilitated the kind of conversations that led to acquisitions, and to tell the stories behind our pieces with just the right blend of knowledge and humility. The Degas in the sitting room belonged to a French family who emigrated to Chicago after the war, I would explain to guests, repeating the narrative Miranda had taught me. They needed to establish themselves quickly and chose to liquidate some of their collection. We were fortunate to be able to provide it with a proper home. These stories always followed the same pattern. Noble families forced by circumstances to sell treasured heirlooms to understanding collectors who would preserve their legacy. Every piece had a romantic backstory that explained how it had come to grace our walls, and I delivered these tales with the practiced warmth of someone who genuinely believed them. Eddie was the perfect husband during these events, attentive without being possessive, knowledgeable without being condescending. He would guide conversations toward my expertise when guests showed interest in authentication or insurance matters, presenting me as an accomplished professional rather than merely a decorative wife. His pride in my work seemed genuine, his respect for my knowledge authentic. "Kendra has an incredible eye for forgeries," he would tell potential clients. "She can spot inconsistencies that would take other experts months to discover. It's quite remarkable, really." This support extended to my growing consulting practice, which had become surprisingly successful under the Castellano name's influence. High-end insurance companies sought my services for their most valuable claims, private collectors hired me to verify acquisitions, and auction houses consulted with me on pieces with questionable provenance. My reputation was building steadily, and I attributed much of that success to the credibility that came with being Eddie's wife. The financial benefits of our marriage were undeniable. My student loans had been paid off within months of our wedding, dismissed as wedding gifts, that I initially protested but eventually accepted. Our lifestyle expanded gradually: better restaurants, more exotic vacations, clothes that cost more than I had once earned in a month. Eddie presented these upgrades as natural progressions, the kind of improvements that came with joining an established family. "You deserve beautiful things," he would say when I expressed concern about expenses. "And frankly, you need to look the part if you want to be taken seriously in this business." Clients expect a certain level of sophistication from someone handling pieces worth millions. My family was initially overwhelmed by the changes in my life, then gradually accepting, and finally somewhat dependent on the generosity that flowed from the Castellano connection. My parents' mortgage was quietly paid off during our second year of marriage, presented as an early inheritance that John Sr. insisted on providing. My sister Callie received a substantial loan to start her interior design business, money that was never expected to be repaid. "Family takes care of family," John Sr. would say when I tried to discuss repayment plans. "Your success reflects well on all of us, and we want your loved ones to share in that prosperity." This generosity extended to Callie in particular, who had struggled financially since her divorce. When Eddie suggested she stay in our guest house while establishing her business, it seemed like the perfect solution. She could save money on rent, I would have my sister nearby, and the estate was certainly large enough to accommodate another resident without crowding. Callie fit into our world more easily than I had expected. She had always been the more social of the two of us, and she quickly became a favorite at family gatherings. Miranda appreciated her eye for design and began consulting with her on redecorating projects around the estate. John Sr. enjoyed her sense of humor and would seek her out for conversations during parties. Even Ash, Eddie's typically reserved younger brother, seemed more relaxed and talkative when Callie was around. "Your sister is delightful," Miranda told me after one of our dinner parties. "She has such natural charm, and her design sense is quite sophisticated. I can see why her business is doing so well." I was proud of how seamlessly Callie had integrated into our family dynamic, and grateful that the Castellanos had welcomed her so warmly. Her presence made our large house feel more like a home, and our weekly sister dinners became highlights of my social calendar. She would tell me about her latest design projects, while I shared stories from my consulting work, and we would laugh about how different our lives had become from our modest childhood in Ohio. The only shadow on our perfect life was Eddie's increasing travel schedule. His business trips had become more frequent and longer in duration, sometimes lasting 2 weeks or more. When I asked about the specifics of his work, his answers were always vague: consulting for collectors in Europe, evaluating potential acquisitions for the family, maintaining relationships with dealers who had worked with the Castellanos for decades. "The art world operates on personal connections," he would explain. "These relationships require constant cultivation, face-to-face meetings, the kind of trust that can only be built through shared experiences. It's tedious, but it's how the family has maintained its position for generations." I accepted these explanations because they aligned with everything I understood about high-end art dealing. The most valuable transactions did indeed happen through personal relationships, and the Castellano collection was evidence of successful cultivation of such connections over decades. Eddie's absences were simply the price of maintaining the family's position in this exclusive world. During his trips, I grew closer to the rest of the family. Miranda and I would have long lunches discussing art history and social obligations, while John Sr. would invite me into his study for conversations about business strategy and family legacy. These interactions made me feel more than just Eddie's wife. I felt like a true daughter of the family, valued for my own contributions rather than simply tolerated as an extension of their son. It was during one of these conversations with John Sr. that I first heard him speak with genuine emotion about protecting what previous generations had built. "My grandfather Sal came to this country with nothing," he told me, his voice heavy with the weight of family history. "Everything you see here, everything we've accomplished, it's all built on his vision and sacrifice. We have a responsibility to preserve that legacy, to ensure that his work wasn't in vain." The reverence in his voice when he spoke of grandfather Sal was unmistakable, and I found myself developing a deep respect for the man who had started it all. The collection that surrounded us wasn't just valuable art. It was a testament to one man's determination to build something lasting for his descendants. Being entrusted with that legacy felt like both an honor and a profound responsibility. Looking back now, I can see how expertly they had woven me into their narrative, making me complicit in protecting secrets I didn't even know existed. Every story they told, every confidence they shared, every piece of family history they revealed was carefully calculated to deepen my loyalty and blind me to the truth that lay beneath their perfect facade. But perfection built on lies has a way of unraveling, and the foundation of my perfect life was about to crumble in ways I could never have imagined. The mahogany conference table had witnessed countless family meetings over the decades, but none quite like this one. As I stood at its head, manila envelope in hand, I could feel the weight of 5 years of carefully constructed lies pressing down on the room like a suffocating blanket. The morning light streaming through the estate's tall windows illuminated faces that had once welcomed me with warmth, but now regarded me with barely concealed hostility. Miranda sat rigidly in her usual chair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood in a rhythm that betrayed her anxiety. She had dressed for battle this morning. Her navy Chanel suit was armor, her pearls a shield, her silver hair styled with military precision. But I could see the tremor in her hands, the slight twitch at the corner of her left eye that appeared whenever she felt her controls slipping. John Sr. occupied the chair at the opposite end of the table, his presence commanding even in his obvious discomfort. His morning routine had been disrupted by this impromptu gathering, and his displeasure showed in the way he kept checking his Rolex, as if punctuality could somehow restore order to a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. The man who had built an empire on stolen art and forged documents was about to learn that some secrets are too heavy to stay buried forever. Ash sat between his parents, looking confused and slightly hungover from whatever party he'd attended the night before. At 28, Eddie's younger brother had always been the family's golden boy, charming, carefree, and blissfully unaware of the darker aspects of the Castellano legacy. His bewilderment at being summoned to this emergency meeting would soon give way to something much more devastating. And then there was Eddie, slumped in his chair like a condemned man awaiting execution. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his face bearing the telltale signs of a sleepless night. He couldn't look at me directly, his eyes focused instead on the Persian rug beneath the table, as if it might offer some escape from the reckoning that awaited him. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on me. This room, with its walls lined with stolen masterpieces, had been the site of so many celebrations during my marriage. Holiday dinners where I'd sat among art worth millions, family meetings where I'd been welcomed as a cherished daughter-in-law, planning sessions for charity events that burnished the Castellano reputation while hiding their crimes. Now it would witness the dismantling of everything they'd built on lies and theft. "I think we should discuss the elephant in the room," I said, my voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Or perhaps I should say elephants, since there are so many secrets we need to address this morning. Miranda's mask of composure slipped slightly. "Kendra, whatever dramatics you're planning, I suggest you reconsider. The family has been more than generous with you, and this display of ungrateful? I laughed, the sound echoing off the coffered ceiling. Miranda, do you know what I discovered when I finally started investigating my own husband's business trips? When I hired a private investigator to track his movements over the past 2 years? The color drained from John Sr.'s face. He understood immediately that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse, that decades of meticulous planning and execution were unraveling because his son couldn't keep his infidelity discreet. I found hotel receipts from cities Eddie claimed he'd never visited, I continued, savoring the growing panic in their eyes. Credit card statements showing charges for jewelry he never gave me. Restaurant bills for romantic dinners with my sister while I sat home alone, believing his lies about business meetings and family obligations. Eddie finally looked up, his face a mask of guilt and desperation. Kendra, please, let me explain. Oh, you'll have plenty of time to explain to the FBI, I said calmly. Because while I was investigating your pathetic affair, I stumbled upon something much more interesting. Did you know that the Monet hanging behind your mother was reported stolen from a private collection in France in 1943? Or that the Picasso in your father's study disappeared from a museum in Barcelona exactly 36 years ago? The silence that followed was deafening. Ash looked between his family members with growing horror as understanding began to dawn. Miranda's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. John Sr.'s face had gone ashen, decades of carefully maintained secrets crashing down around him. That's impossible, Miranda whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Those pieces have been in the family for generations. The documentation is masterfully forged, I interrupted. I should know. I've spent the better part of 2 years authenticating every piece in this house. Your grandfather Sal wasn't a legitimate art dealer, Miranda. He was a thief who capitalized on the chaos of World War II to steal priceless works from Jewish families fleeing the Holocaust. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. This was the truth they'd spent 3 generations hiding, the foundation of guilt and blood money upon which their entire empire was built. Grandfather Sal hadn't been the noble immigrant who'd built success through hard work and clever investments. He'd been a predator who'd profited from one of history's greatest tragedies. Every piece in this collection tells the same story, I continued, opening the manila envelope with deliberate precision. Families destroyed by war, collections seized by Sal Castellano and his associates, documentation forged to create false provenance, artworks laundered through shell companies and private sales to hide their true origins. I pulled out the first photograph, a detailed image of their prized Van Gogh, alongside historical documents showing its theft from the Rosenberg family in Amsterdam in 1943. The family had been deported to Auschwitz. None had survived to reclaim their stolen artwork. The Rosenbergs had 3 children, I said, watching their faces as the reality sank in. Sarah was 8, David was 12, and little Rachel was only 5 when they were forced from their home. This painting hung in their dining room, where they celebrated holidays and birthdays, and dreamed of a future that Sal Castellano helped destroy. Miranda made a choking sound, her hand pressed to her mouth as if she could somehow prevent the truth from escaping. John Sr. stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, but he had nowhere to run from the evidence I'd compiled. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice shaking with rage and desperation. Those are allegations, speculation. They're facts, I said firmly. Documented facts that I've spent months verifying with museums, international databases, and Holocaust research organizations. Every piece in this collection is stolen property, and every dollar of the Castellano fortune is built on theft and murder. I pulled out more photographs, spreading them across the table like playing cards in a deadly game. Each image showed a piece from their collection, alongside documentation of its theft, its original owners, and the tragic circumstances that had allowed Sal Castellano to claim it as his own. The Degas from the sitting room belonged to the Kohn family in Vienna. The small Renoir that always seemed familiar to me was stolen from the Levy collection in Paris. That beautiful sculpture in the garden? It was taken from the home of a Jewish art dealer in Berlin, whose entire family was murdered for trying to protect their cultural heritage. Ash had gone pale, staring at the photographs with the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. This can't be true, he whispered. We're not We don't. You are, I said gently, feeling sympathy for the only family member who'd been genuinely innocent of their crimes. Your great-grandfather was a Nazi collaborator who specialized in stealing art from Jewish families. Your grandfather continued the business, laundering stolen works through legitimate channels. Your father has spent his entire life maintaining the facade while continuing to profit from genocide. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Genocide. That's what this was. Not just theft, but participation in the systematic destruction of European Jewry, profiting from their suffering while building a reputation as cultured, sophisticated art lovers. The FBI's art crime team has been very interested in my research, I continued, savoring the fear that now dominated every face around the table. They've opened investigations into 17 pieces in your collection, with more to follow. The restitution claims alone will bankrupt you, assuming you avoid criminal prosecution for receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. The manila envelope still held more secrets, more evidence, more devastating revelations that would complete the destruction of everything the Castellano family had built on blood and lies. But first, I wanted them to fully understand how completely their world had changed in the space of a single morning. Their perfect facade was crumbling, and I was just getting started. The moment that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March, exactly 8 months ago. Eddie was in Geneva on one of his increasingly frequent business trips, and I was alone in the mansion, working on a complex authentication case for Lloyd's of London. The case involved a disputed Cézanne that had surfaced at auction with questionable provenance, and I needed to cross-reference it against databases of stolen art. As I sat in John Sr.'s study, surrounded by the tools of my trade, magnifying glasses, UV lights, and stacks of authentication catalogs, I found myself staring at the small Renoir that hung just above the computer monitor. That nagging feeling of familiarity had been growing stronger over the months, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. The painting depicted a young woman in a blue dress, her expression melancholy yet hopeful, and something about her eyes seemed to call out to me across the decades. I had seen this painting before, but not here in the Castellano home, I was certain of it. Acting on impulse, I photographed the Renoir with my high-resolution camera and uploaded the image to the Art Recovery International database, a comprehensive catalog of stolen and missing artworks that I accessed regularly for my consulting work. The search parameters I entered were broad: painted between 1875 to 1885, subject matter showing a young woman, medium oil on canvas. What came back made my blood run cold. Young Woman in Blue by Pierre-Auguste Renoir, stolen from the private collection of Dr. Samuel Lévy in Paris, March 15, 1943. The database entry included a black-and-white photograph taken for insurance purposes in 1939, showing the identical painting hanging in Dr. Lévy's elegant Parisian townhouse. The file noted that Dr. Lévy, his wife Rachel, and their 2 teenage daughters had been deported to Drancy internment camp. None had survived the war. I stared at the computer screen for what felt like hours, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. The painting hanging innocently above the monitor, the one Miranda had told guests belonged to a French family who needed to liquidate quickly after the war, was stolen Nazi loot. The romantic story of generous collectors helping refugees was a lie designed to hide a much darker truth. My hands shook as I printed the database entry, comparing the black and white photograph to the painting on the wall. Every detail matched perfectly. The brushstrokes around the subject's left ear, the distinctive way Renoir had captured the fabric of her dress, even a small imperfection in the canvas near the bottom right corner. This was undeniably the same painting, stolen from a Jewish family who had paid for it with their lives. But if this painting was stolen, what about the others? I spent the next 4 hours methodically photographing every major piece in the house, uploading each image to various databases and auction house records. The results were devastating. Piece after piece came back with reports of theft, suspicious ownership transfers, or gaps in provenance that coincided with the chaos of World War II. The Monet water lilies in the main hallway, stolen from the Rothschild collection in Vienna, 1938. The small Picasso sketch in the guest bathroom, missing from a private collection in Berlin since 1943. The beautiful Degas ballerina sculpture in the sitting room, taken from the home of a Jewish art dealer in Amsterdam who had been murdered by the SS. As the evidence mounted, I felt physically sick. Every dinner party where I had proudly shared the stories Miranda had taught me, every tour I had given to admiring guests, every moment I had basked in the reflected glory of the Castellano collection, it had all been built on lies and blood money. The worst discovery came when I searched for the Van Gogh that served as the centerpiece of their collection. Wheat fields with cypresses hung in the main gallery, positioned to catch the afternoon light in a way that made the painted landscape seem almost alive. It was John Sr.'s favorite piece, the one he would stand before during family gatherings, talking about the vision and sacrifice of grandfather Sal. The database entry was even more detailed than the others. The painting had belonged to the Rosenberg family of Amsterdam, successful diamond merchants who had collected art for 3 generations. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, Saul Rosenberg had tried to hide his most valuable pieces, including this Van Gogh, in a secret room behind his jewelry shop. But someone had betrayed the family's hiding place to the SS. The report included witness statements from neighbors who had seen uniformed men loading artworks into trucks, while the Rosenberg family was forced to watch from the sidewalk, their hands bound behind their backs. 3 days later, the entire family, parents, grandparents, and 3 young children, had been shipped to Westerbork transit camp. From there, they had been transported to Sobibor extermination camp, where all traces of them had disappeared into the Nazi machinery of death. The painting's journey from the Rosenberg home to the Castellano collection was documented in captured Nazi records that had been discovered decades after the war. An SS Oberfuhrer named Klaus Weber had been responsible for cultural acquisitions in occupied territories, systematically looting Jewish collections and shipping the most valuable pieces to private buyers who paid premium prices for stolen art with no questions asked. One of those buyers had been Salvatore Sal Castellano, an Italian-American businessman who specialized in importing European antiques during and after the war. The paperwork was all there in the captured Nazi files: bills of sale, shipping manifests, even correspondence between Weber and Sal, discussing the acquisition opportunities created by the relocation of Jewish families. Sal Castellano hadn't just purchased stolen art, he had been part of the Nazi network that made the Holocaust profitable for criminals willing to profit from genocide. I printed everything, creating a file that grew thicker with each new discovery. By the time Eddie returned from his trip 3 days later, I had documented the theft of 47 pieces in the Castellano collection, with evidence linking each one to families who had been murdered, deported, or forced to flee for their lives. But I couldn't let him know what I had found. Not yet. The challenge was maintaining my normal routine while processing the magnitude of what I had discovered. Every family dinner became an exercise in controlling my revulsion as Miranda told her sanitized stories about grateful European families. Every conversation with John Sr. about family legacy felt like listening to a war criminal justify genocide. And every night lying next to Eddie, I wondered how much he knew about the blood money that had funded our comfortable life. I started taking notes, documenting not just the stolen art but the family's behavior patterns. Who knew what? When had they learned the truth about grandfather Sal? Were they all complicit in maintaining the lies, or were some of them genuinely ignorant about the source of their wealth? Miranda's stories were too polished, too consistent to be anything but carefully rehearsed lies. She knew exactly what she was covering up. John Sr.'s reverent attitude toward his grandfather took on a sinister cast. He wasn't just preserving family history, he was protecting a criminal legacy. But what about Eddie? What about Ash? I began paying closer attention to family conversations, listening for clues about who knew what. During one particularly revealing dinner, John Sr. made an offhand comment about the importance of discretion when dealing with European acquisitions from the 1940s. Miranda shot him a sharp look, and the conversation quickly moved to safer topics. But the implication was clear. They knew their collection was problematic, and they had spent decades keeping those problems quiet. The psychological toll of maintaining normalcy while harboring such devastating knowledge was enormous. I would smile and nod during family gatherings, all while imagining the faces of the children who had been murdered so that these paintings could hang on the Castellano walls. I would listen to Miranda plan charity galas for Holocaust remembrance organizations, knowing that her own home was filled with stolen art from Holocaust victims. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it also gave me an idea. If the Castellano family wanted to play the role of cultured philanthropists, if they wanted to be pillars of Chicago society while hiding their criminal past, then they had given me the perfect weapon to destroy them. Their reputation, their social standing, their entire identity was built on maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. What would happen when that illusion was shattered? What would happen when Chicago society learned that their beloved art collectors were actually the descendants of Nazi collaborators? I began planning my next move, knowing that I would need irrefutable evidence and perfect timing to bring down an empire built on 3 generations of lies. The Castellano family had spent decades perfecting their facade, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had married their son to someone who specialized in uncovering art fraud. And now, with Eddie's betrayal removing any obligation I felt to protect their secrets, I was free to pursue justice for all the families whose treasures had been stolen and whose lives had been destroyed. The discovery phase was complete. Now it was time to begin building the case that would destroy them all. What I discovered in the weeks following my initial research was far worse than simple art theft. As I delved deeper into the Castellano family's history, a pattern emerged that revealed 3 generations of systematic criminal enterprise, each more sophisticated than the last. The captured Nazi documents I found through the Holocaust Claims Processing Office painted a chilling picture of Grandfather Sal's operations during World War II. He hadn't been a passive buyer of stolen art. He had been an active participant in the Nazi looting machine, providing financing and logistics for SS units tasked with cultural acquisition across occupied Europe. Sal's correspondence with SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, discovered in the Nuremberg trial archives, revealed the cold business calculations behind genocide. The Bernstein collection in Prague shows exceptional promise, Sal had written in December 1942. I can arrange immediate payment upon acquisition, with transport to New York facilitated through our Swiss contacts. The family's cooperation is, of course, irrelevant to our transaction. The Bernstein family, a respected lineage of art dealers who had been active in Prague for over 2 centuries, had been murdered 3 weeks after that letter was written. Their entire collection, accumulated over generations, had been crated and shipped to Sal Castellano's warehouse in Chicago, where it was dispersed to private collectors who paid premium prices for pieces with discreet provenance. But Sal's crimes extended beyond individual thefts. I discovered evidence that he had helped establish what the Nazis called Kunstraub-Netzwerk, art theft networks that operated across occupied territories. These networks were responsible for the systematic looting of Jewish collections, museum holdings, and cultural treasures from conquered nations. Sal's role was to provide American distribution channels, ensuring that stolen art could be laundered through legitimate sales and reach buyers who either didn't know or didn't care about the blood on their paintings. The scope of the operation was staggering. Through shipping manifests and customs documents I obtained from the National Archives, I traced over 300 pieces that had passed through Sal's network between 1940 and 1947. Each item represented not just theft, but murder. Families destroyed so that wealthy Americans could decorate their homes with stolen European culture. The most damning evidence came from a ledger I found referenced in FBI files from the 1950s. During the post-war investigations into Nazi collaboration, federal agents had raided Sal's Chicago warehouse and discovered meticulous records of his transactions. The ledger, introduced as evidence in congressional hearings but later sealed, contained detailed entries for each piece: original owner, date of acquisition, SS contact who facilitated the theft, sale price, and American buyer. One entry, dated March 15, 1943, read simply, Levy Collection, Paris, 14 pieces acquired via Weber. Renoir, young woman, blue dress, allocated to family collection. Payment, $50,000 USD plus transportation costs. Note: original owners deceased per Weber confirmation. $50,000 for art stolen from a murdered family. The casual notation of their deaths, reduced to a simple business footnote, revealed the utter dehumanization that had made the Holocaust profitable for men like Sal Castellano. But Sal's criminal legacy hadn't ended with the war. As Europe rebuilt and survivors began searching for their stolen heritage, Sal had established an elaborate system for hiding his ill-gotten collection. He created shell companies, forged provenance documents, and bribed officials to ensure that his stolen artworks could never be traced back to their true origins. The second generation, John Sr.'s father, Antonio Castellano, had modernized the family's criminal operations during the 1960s and 70s. While maintaining the legitimate facade of art dealing, Antonio had expanded into money laundering for organized crime families, using high-value art transactions to clean dirty money from drug trafficking, extortion, and other illegal enterprises. Federal surveillance files I obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that Antonio had been under FBI investigation for over a decade before his death in 1979. The Bureau suspected him of laundering millions of dollars through fraudulent art sales, but could never gather enough evidence for prosecution. The investigation had been closed when Antonio died of a heart attack, taking his secrets to the grave. John Sr. had inherited not just the family business, but its criminal connections. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, he had continued using art transactions to launder money, while also expanding into insurance fraud through staged thefts and false damage claims. The legitimate side of the business provided perfect cover for these activities, allowing the Castellanos to maintain their reputation as respected members of Chicago's cultural elite. But it was the personal cost of these crimes that haunted me most. As I researched the families whose art had been stolen, I began to understand the human toll of the Castellano legacy. The Rosenberg children who had been murdered for their Van Gogh. The Levy daughters who had died in concentration camps while their Renoir hung in the Castellano dining room. The Bernstein family whose centuries of cultural stewardship had been erased in a single night of Nazi brutality. Each painting on the Castellano walls represented not just theft, but the destruction of entire family lines. The art they displayed so proudly was a collection of tombstones, marking the graves of families who had died protecting their cultural heritage. I found surviving relatives of some of the victims, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had spent decades searching for their family's stolen treasures. Sarah Rosenberg Klein, a retired teacher living in New York, had been born in a displaced persons camp after the war. Her entire extended family had been murdered, and she had spent 50 years trying to locate their missing artworks, including the Van Gogh that now served as the centerpiece of the Castellano collection. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about that painting," Sarah had written in a letter to various restitution organizations. "It hung in their dining room in Amsterdam, and she would point to the cypress trees and tell us children that they represented hope, that no matter how dark the world became, there was always something reaching toward the light." The irony was devastating. The very painting that represented hope to a murdered family had become a symbol of the Castellanos' pride in their criminal legacy. John Sr. would stand before it during family gatherings, talking about his grandfather's vision and sacrifice, never acknowledging that the sacrifice had been paid in Jewish blood. As my research expanded, I realized that bringing down the Castellano family wasn't just about exposing their crimes. It was about returning stolen heritage to the families who had paid for it with their lives. Every piece in their collection had relatives somewhere in the world, survivors who deserved to know the fate of their family's treasures. The magnitude of justice that needed to be served went far beyond anything the law could provide. This wasn't just about prison sentences or financial restitution. It was about honoring the memory of families who had been erased from history so that criminals could profit from their suffering. The Castellano family had built their empire on the graves of Holocaust victims. Now it was time to tear down that empire and give the dead the justice they had been denied for over 70 years. Building a case against 3 generations of carefully concealed war crimes required resources and expertise I couldn't access alone. I needed allies who understood both the legal complexities of art restitution and the historical nuances of Nazi looting operations. More importantly, I needed people who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or discredited by the Castellano family's wealth and influence. My first call was to Dr. Rachel Goldman at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Goldman headed their art recovery and restitution program, and her reputation for meticulous research and uncompromising integrity made her the perfect ally. When I explained what I had discovered about the Castellano collection, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest private collections of Nazi-looted art still in American hands," she said during our first phone conversation. "The implications go far beyond the Castellano family. This could expose an entire network of dealers and collectors who have been hiding stolen art for decades." Dr. Goldman connected me with Agent Patricia Hendricks of the FBI's Art Crime Team, a specialist in Nazi-era thefts who had spent her career tracking stolen cultural property. Agent Hendricks had been waiting years for a break in cases involving high-profile American collectors, and the evidence I presented opened investigative possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "The challenge with these old cases has always been documentation," Agent Hendricks explained during our first meeting in a discreet coffee shop near the federal building. "The Nazis were meticulous record keepers, but most of those records were destroyed or scattered. What you found, original correspondence, shipping manifests, financial records, it's exactly what we need to build prosecutable cases." Together, we developed a strategy that would simultaneously gather additional evidence while protecting me from the Castellano family's inevitable retaliation. Agent Hendricks arranged for surveillance of my activities, ensuring that any attempts to intimidate or harm me would be documented. Dr. Goldman provided access to international databases and survivor testimonies that would help establish the human cost of the Castellano crimes. The investigation expanded rapidly as new evidence emerged. Through contacts at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I connected with researchers who had been tracking Nazi art theft networks for decades. They provided additional documentation linking Sal Castellano to SS officers beyond Klaus Weber, revealing that his criminal activities had been even more extensive than my initial research had suggested. Dr. Maria Santos, a historian at the Wiesenthal Center, shared captured Gestapo files that referenced Sal by name as a, quote, reliable American contact for cultural liquidation. These files detailed specific operations where Sal had provided advance payment for artworks that were then stolen from Jewish families who were subsequently murdered. The premeditation was unmistakable. Sal hadn't just bought stolen art. He had helped finance the murders that made the thefts possible. Perhaps the most devastating discovery came through international cooperation with European restitution organizations. The Commission for Looted Art in Europe had been tracking the dispersal of specific collections for decades, and when I shared my findings about the Castellano holdings, they were able to provide documentation that connected dozens of pieces to families who had been searching for their stolen heritage. The Goldman collection from Vienna, the Steinberg holdings from Prague, the Rosenfeld artworks from Berlin, family after family, had been systematically destroyed, while their cultural treasures were shipped to Sal Castellano's warehouse in Chicago. Each case represented not just theft, but the erasure of centuries of cultural continuity, the destruction of family legacies that had been built over generations. Working with these organizations, I began reaching out to survivors and descendants of the original owners. These conversations were among the most difficult aspects of my investigation, as I had to explain to elderly survivors that their family's stolen art had been hanging in my home for the past 5 years, that I had unknowingly participated in perpetuating the crimes committed against their relatives. Sarah Rosenberg Klein, the survivor whose family's Van Gogh graced the Castellano Gallery, agreed to meet with me at her apartment in Manhattan. At 92, she was one of the last living links to the murdered Rosenberg family, and her testimony would be crucial for any restitution claims. "I was 6 years old when they took us from our home," she told me, her hands shaking as she showed me pre-war photographs of her family. "I remember my grandfather lifting me up to touch that painting, telling me that the cypress trees were reaching toward heaven. He said that no matter what happened to us, the painting would always remember our family." The weight of her words was overwhelming. For over 70 years, she had wondered what had happened to her family's treasures, never knowing that they had been stolen by Nazi collaborators and were being displayed as trophies by their American accomplices. The thought that I had admired that same painting, that I had listened to John Sr. speak proudly of his grandfather's vision, made me physically ill. But Sarah's reaction surprised me. Instead of anger or recrimination, she expressed gratitude that the truth was finally emerging. "My family died believing their heritage would be lost forever," she said. "Knowing that someone is finally seeking justice for them, it means more than you can imagine." As word of my investigation spread through restitution networks, more survivors and descendants began coming forward. Each had stories of stolen art, missing heirlooms, and family treasures that had vanished during the Holocaust. Many had spent decades searching for their heritage, working with limited resources, and facing institutional indifference from museums, auction houses, and private collectors who preferred not to investigate uncomfortable questions about provenance. The pattern that emerged was consistent across all cases. Sal Castellano and his network had specifically targeted collections from wealthy Jewish families, knowing that the owners would likely be murdered and unable to pursue restitution claims. The selection wasn't random. It was strategic, calculated to minimize the risk of future legal challenges while maximizing the value of stolen goods. Dr. Goldman helped me understand the broader context of these crimes. "What your research reveals is that the Holocaust wasn't just about murder. It was about the systematic destruction of Jewish culture and heritage," she explained. "Men like Sal Castellano didn't just profit from genocide, they helped make it financially sustainable for the Nazi regime." The evidence we compiled painted a picture of criminal enterprise that spanned continents and decades. Sal's network had included dealers in New York, collectors in California, and museum officials who had knowingly acquired stolen pieces with fabricated provenance documents. The American art world's willful blindness to inconvenient questions about ownership had made these crimes possible and profitable. But perhaps the most important discovery was that the statute of limitations didn't apply to stolen cultural property. Under both federal law and international treaties, artworks stolen during the Holocaust could be reclaimed by their rightful owners, regardless of how much time had passed. The Castellano family's carefully constructed legal protections were meaningless when confronted with evidence of their criminal foundation. As my investigation neared completion, I realized that exposing the Castellano crimes would do more than destroy one family's criminal empire. It would force the entire American art world to confront its complicity in concealing Nazi loot, potentially leading to restitution claims that could affect hundreds of museums, galleries, and private collectors, who had spent decades hiding behind fabricated provenance documents and willful ignorance. The scope of justice that awaited was far greater than I had initially imagined, and the Castellano family's anniversary celebration was about to become ground zero for a reckoning that had been 70 years in the making. Living with the knowledge of what I had discovered while maintaining the facade of a loving wife and daughter-in-law became the most psychologically demanding performance of my life. Every family dinner was a masterclass in deception, every social gathering a test of my ability to smile while surrounded by the evidence of genocide. The most challenging moments came during the family's regular entertaining schedule. As autumn approached, Miranda had planned a series of intimate dinner parties for potential donors to the Art Institute's upcoming exhibition on, quote, European Masterworks, a Century of Private Collecting. The irony of the theme, celebrating private collectors who had preserved European art during times of turmoil, was so thick I could barely breathe. During one particularly difficult evening in September, we hosted Dr. Timothy Harrison, the Art Institute's chief curator, along with several board members and their spouses. The conversation naturally turned to the ethical considerations of wartime art acquisition, and I found myself sitting at a table laden with stolen treasures, while listening to an academic discussion about the moral complexities of collecting during periods of historical upheaval. The challenge for today's collectors, Dr. Harrison explained while admiring the Degas sculpture that had been stolen from the murdered Amsterdam dealer, is understanding that provenance research isn't just about establishing legal ownership, it's about honoring the cultural heritage of the original owners. Miranda nodded sagely, playing the role of the thoughtful collector to perfection. The Castellano family has always believed in the importance of preserving these masterpieces for future generations, she said, her voice filled with practiced sincerity. We see ourselves as custodians rather than owners, protecting these works until they can find their proper homes. The breathtaking hypocrisy of her words, spoken while sitting beneath a Van Gogh stolen from a murdered family, required every ounce of my self-control to endure. I excused myself to the powder room, where I stood trembling with rage and disgust, staring at my reflection in the mirror while trying to compose myself for the remainder of the evening. But these social challenges paled in comparison to the intimate moments with Eddie. As my investigation progressed, and his affair with Callie intensified, I found myself studying his behavior with new eyes, searching for clues about how much he knew about his family's criminal history. His knowledge became apparent during a casual conversation about insurance coverage for our art collection. Eddie was updating our policies, and he made an offhand comment that revealed more than he intended. The European pieces require special documentation, he said while reviewing paperwork. Dad always says the key is maintaining consistent narratives across all the official records. Any discrepancies could raise uncomfortable questions with the insurance companies. The phrasing was telling. Maintaining consistent narratives wasn't the language of legitimate art collecting. It was the vocabulary of someone actively concealing criminal activity. Eddie knew the family's stories about their collection were fabricated, and he was actively participating in perpetuating those lies. This revelation added another layer of betrayal to his affair with Callie. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to abandon me while leaving me vulnerable to the consequences of crimes I had unwittingly helped conceal. If federal investigators had discovered the truth about the Castellano collection before I did, I could have faced prosecution as an accessory to receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. The psychological toll of maintaining normalcy while harboring such explosive knowledge began affecting my sleep and appetite. I started experiencing panic attacks during family gatherings, triggered by seemingly innocent conversations about the collection or references to family history. The stress was compounded by the constant fear that someone would notice my changed behavior and begin asking questions I couldn't answer. I developed elaborate routines to mask my distress. I practiced facial expressions in the mirror, rehearsing responses to typical family conversations. I created mental scripts for different scenarios, preparing explanations for any unusual behavior that might raise suspicion. Every interaction became a calculated performance, designed to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. The most dangerous moments came when John Sr. would discuss family business with increasing frequency. As Eddie's travel schedule intensified and his attention focused more on his affair, John Sr. began including me in conversations about long-term planning for the collection. He spoke about estate planning, succession arrangements, and the importance of ensuring that family secrets remained protected for future generations. "You're part of this legacy now, Kendra," he would say during these discussions. "The family trusts you to understand the delicate nature of our position. Some stories are better left in the past, don't you think?" These conversations felt like tests, probing to see whether I could be trusted with deeper secrets, or whether I might become a liability that needed to be managed. The way John Sr. watched my reactions during these discussions suggested he was evaluating my trustworthiness, perhaps considering whether to reveal more about the family's criminal activities, or whether to begin limiting my access to sensitive information. Meanwhile, Callie's presence in our home became increasingly uncomfortable, as I observed her growing intimacy with not just Eddie, but the entire family. She had begun joining us for more family dinners, offering design advice for various rooms, and participating in conversations about art and collecting with an enthusiasm that once would have pleased me, but now felt like salt in an open wound. The worst part was watching how naturally she fit into their world of lies and pretense. When Miranda told her sanitized stories about the collection's origins, Callie listened with rapt attention, asking follow-up questions and expressing admiration for the family's sophisticated taste and generous preservation efforts. Her genuine enthusiasm for the collection felt like a betrayal not just of our sisterly relationship, but of the murdered families whose treasures she was unknowingly celebrating. As November approached and Eddie's behavior became increasingly distant and distracted, I realized that my time as a trusted family member was running out. His affair was progressing towards some kind of resolution, and I sensed that major changes were being planned without my knowledge. The family's anniversary tradition was approaching, and this year's celebration would likely mark the end of my marriage and my access to the evidence I needed to bring them down. The irony wasn't lost on me that Eddie's betrayal, which had caused me such personal pain, had actually freed me to pursue justice for far greater betrayals. If he had remained a faithful husband, I might never have investigated deeply enough to uncover the truth about his family's crimes. His infidelity had removed any moral obligation I felt to protect their secrets, transforming me from an unwitting accomplice into an instrument of long overdue justice. But time was running out, and I needed to accelerate my plans before Eddie's abandonment left me without access to the evidence that could bring down their criminal empire. The upcoming anniversary celebration would provide the perfect opportunity for a reckoning that would honor the memory of the Castellano family's victims while ensuring that their decades of profitable criminality finally faced consequences. The dangerous pretense was nearly over. Soon the truth would emerge with devastating force. The month leading up to our anniversary required the most careful preparation of my life. I had one opportunity to orchestrate the perfect exposure of the Castellano family's crimes. And failure would mean not just personal destruction, but the continued concealment of justice for Holocaust victims whose suffering had funded decades of criminal prosperity. My first priority was ensuring the safety and accessibility of all evidence I had compiled. Working with Agent Hendricks, I established multiple secure repositories for the documentation that would destroy the Castellano empire. Copies of all files were stored in safety deposit boxes across 3 different states, with additional sets held by Dr. Goldman at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and Dr. Santos at the Wiesenthal Center. But physical evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient. I needed to coordinate a multi-pronged assault that would simultaneously expose the family's crimes to law enforcement, the media, and the survivors' families who deserved to reclaim their stolen heritage. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and they might have time to mount a legal counterattack or destroy additional evidence. Too late, and Eddie's planned abandonment would remove my access to their inner circle. Agent Hendricks helped me develop a comprehensive strategy that would unfold over the course of a single weekend. The key is overwhelming them with simultaneous revelations from multiple sources, she explained during one of our clandestine meetings. By the time they understand what's happening, it will be too late to contain the damage. The plan began with my coordination with international media outlets that specialized in art restitution stories. The Washington Post's investigative team had been tracking Nazi art theft for years, waiting for a case with the scope and documentation needed to command national attention. When I provided them with exclusive access to the Castellano evidence, they immediately assigned their top reporters to develop a comprehensive exposé. "This story has everything," explained Sarah Martinez, the Post's chief investigative reporter. "War crimes, American complicity, stolen art worth hundreds of millions, and survivors who can put human faces on the tragedy. When this breaks, it's going to reshape how the art world handles restitution claims." But I wanted more than just media coverage. I wanted the Castellano family to face the survivors themselves, to hear firsthand accounts of the families they had helped destroy. Working with restitution organizations, I arranged for Sarah Rosenberg Klein and 3 other survivors to travel to Chicago for what I described as a, quote, private viewing of potentially relevant artworks. The survivors didn't know the full scope of what we had planned. They believed they were coming to examine pieces that might be connected to their family's stolen collections, unaware that they would be confronting the actual perpetrators face to face. The emotional impact of their presence would add a power to our revelation that no amount of documentation could provide. Dr. Goldman helped me coordinate with the FBI's art crime team to ensure that federal agents would be present during the confrontation. "We need to document their reactions to the accusations," Agent Hendricks explained. "Any attempts to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses will strengthen our case for prosecution." The most delicate aspect of my preparation involved managing my relationship with Callie. I couldn't reveal what I had discovered about the family she was unknowingly helping destroy, but I needed to protect her from the fallout that would inevitably follow Eddie's public exposure as part of a criminal enterprise. During one of our weekly sister dinners in early November, I carefully planted seeds that might prepare her for what was coming. "Callie, have you ever thought about what would happen if the Castellano family had financial problems?" I asked casually while we shared dessert. She laughed, finding the idea absurd. Kendra, they're worth hundreds of millions. What kind of financial problems could they possibly have? I'm just saying, their whole lifestyle is built around their art collection and reputation. If something threatened either of those things, the entire foundation of their wealth could collapse very quickly. Her confusion was evident, but I could see her beginning to consider possibilities she had never imagined. Is everything okay with Eddie's business? You've seemed stressed lately. I forced a smile, knowing that her concern was genuine even as she was unknowingly sleeping with my husband. Just thinking about the future, that's all. Sometimes the things we think are most secure turn out to be the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, I began making my own preparations for the aftermath. I opened new bank accounts under my maiden name, transferred funds that were solely mine out of joint accounts, and secured independent legal representation. If the Castellano family attempted to retaliate by claiming I was complicit in their crimes, I needed to be prepared to defend myself. The most emotionally challenging preparation involved writing letters to the families whose art graced the Castellano walls. Each letter explained how I had discovered their stolen heritage, expressed my horror at having unknowingly participated in concealing their family's suffering, and committed to ensuring their treasures would be returned to their rightful heirs. To Sarah Rosenberg Klein, I wrote, I cannot undo the years I spent admiring your family's Van Gogh without knowing its true history, but I can ensure that your grandfather's words about the cypress trees reaching toward heaven will finally be honored. Your family's hope will be restored, and their murderers will face justice. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most crucial element. I spent hours rehearsing the confrontation scene, anticipating every possible reaction and preparing responses that would maximize the emotional and legal impact of my revelations. I practiced maintaining composure while delivering devastating accusations, knowing that the moment required perfect control to achieve maximum effect. I also prepared for the inevitable attempts at intimidation and manipulation that would follow. The Castellano family would likely try to portray me as an unstable, vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge through false accusations. My response needed to be measured, factual, and impossible to dismiss as emotional hysteria. Agent Hendricks helped me understand the legal protections available for whistleblowers in cases involving war crimes and stolen cultural property. Once you make these accusations publicly and provide supporting evidence, you'll be protected under federal witness protection statutes, she explained. Anyone who attempts to retaliate against you will face additional federal charges. As the anniversary date approached, I could feel the weight of decades of hidden crimes pressing down on the Castellano mansion like a gathering storm. Every family dinner felt like the last act of a tragedy that had been building for over 70 years. The stolen paintings seemed to watch from their frames, waiting for the moment when their true stories would finally be told. The elaborate preparations were nearly complete. The survivors were prepared to travel to Chicago. The media was ready to break the story. Federal agents were positioned to document everything and make arrests if necessary. The evidence was safely stored and waiting to be revealed. All that remained was to deliver the final performance of my marriage, to stand before the family that had welcomed me as a daughter and reveal the truth about their empire built on genocide. The anniversary celebration that was meant to mark my abandonment would instead become the moment when 70 years of silence finally ended. The trap was set, and the Castellano family had no idea that their day of reckoning had finally arrived. The week of our anniversary brought an electricity to the air that only I could feel. While the Castellano family went about their normal routines, Miranda planning her holiday charity gala, John Sr. meeting with estate attorneys, Ash preparing for another of his extended European vacations, I was orchestrating the final details of their downfall with the precision of a military operation. Eddie's behavior had become increasingly erratic as the date approached. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming to run errands that took far longer than they should. His phone conversations moved to private locations, and I would catch him having hushed discussions with Callie that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. The anticipation in their glances, the barely suppressed excitement in their voices, they were clearly planning something significant for our anniversary weekend. I had no doubt that Eddie intended to abandon me that night, probably with some grand gesture designed to humiliate me while positioning himself as the wronged party seeking happiness with my own sister. The cruel irony of their timing couldn't have been more perfect for my purposes. While they prepared to destroy my personal life, I was preparing to destroy everything they had built on lies and genocide. Agent Hendricks finalized the coordination with her team, ensuring that federal agents would be strategically positioned around the estate during the weekend's events. "We'll have surveillance teams monitoring all exits," she explained during our last planning meeting. "If anyone attempts to flee or destroy evidence, we'll be ready to intervene immediately." The media coordination had reached its final stages as well. Sarah Martinez from the Washington Post had assembled a team of reporters and photographers who would arrive at the estate Sunday morning, ostensibly to cover what they believed would be a story about art authentication disputes. They had no idea they were walking into the exposure of one of the largest Nazi art theft operations in American history. But perhaps the most emotionally charged element of my final preparations involved the arrival of the Holocaust survivors. Sarah Rosenberg Klein had flown in from New York, along with 3 other elderly survivors whose families' artworks hung in the Castellano collection. Each carried with them not just the weight of personal loss, but the hopes of countless families who had died, believing their cultural heritage was lost forever. I met with them Friday evening at a downtown hotel, explaining for the first time the full scope of what we had discovered and what would unfold over the weekend. The room fell silent as I laid out photograph after photograph, showing them their families' stolen treasures displayed as trophies in the Castellano mansion. "My father's last words to me were about that sculpture," whispered Ruth Goldman, a 90-year-old survivor whose family's Rodin had been stolen from their Vienna home in 1938. "He said no matter what happened to us, the art would survive to tell our story. I never imagined it would be telling lies for the people who helped murder us." The weight of their pain and the magnitude of justice we were about to serve filled the hotel room like a sacred presence. These weren't just victims seeking restitution, they were witnesses to one of history's greatest crimes, finally being given the opportunity to confront the American families who had profited from their suffering. Dr. Goldman had flown in from Washington to coordinate the survivors' testimony and ensure their statements would be properly documented for future legal proceedings. "What you're doing," she told me privately, "will establish precedents that could affect restitution cases for decades to come. This is bigger than just the Castellano family. This is about forcing America to confront its complicity in concealing Nazi war crimes." The final piece of my preparation involved setting the perfect stage for Sunday morning's revelation. I had convinced Miranda to host what I described as a, quote, private viewing for potential donors to her upcoming charity auction. The event would bring together art historians, museum officials, and prominent collectors. Exactly the kind of witnesses whose presence would make it impossible for the family to contain the story or dismiss it as a private family dispute. "It's brilliant, darling," Miranda had gushed when I proposed the idea. "Showing the collection to serious collectors will reinforce our reputation and potentially identify pieces we might consider donating for tax advantages." The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's cultural elite: the Art Institute's board members, directors from several major museums, prominent private collectors, and art journalists whose coverage would amplify whatever story emerged from the weekend. They would arrive expecting to see a sophisticated private collection. Instead, they would witness the exposure of systematic war crimes. But the most crucial preparation was psychological. I spent hours practicing my presentation, timing each revelation for maximum impact, while maintaining the composure necessary to deliver such devastating accusations credibly. Every gesture, every pause, every emotional beat had to be perfectly calibrated to achieve the desired effect. I rehearsed my opening words countless times. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here today to view a remarkable art collection. What you're about to discover is that every piece you see was stolen from Jewish families who were murdered during the Holocaust, and this family has spent 70 years profiting from genocide." The evening before our anniversary, as I sat in the study surrounded by stolen masterpieces that would soon be returned to their rightful heirs, I felt a strange sense of peace. The performance was nearly over. The truth was about to emerge. Justice that had been delayed for 7 decades was finally at hand. Eddie arrived home late that Friday night, his excitement barely contained, as he prepared for what he believed would be his liberation weekend. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone whose plans were proceeding perfectly, unaware that his family's empire was about to crumble around him. "Tomorrow's gonna be a big day," he said as we prepared for bed, his words carrying meanings he couldn't possibly imagine. "Yes," I replied, watching him in the mirror as I brushed my hair. "I think it's gonna be the most important day in the history of this family." He smiled, misinterpreting my words as anticipation for his romantic dinner plans. If only he knew that his carefully orchestrated abandonment would coincide with the exposure of crimes that would destroy not just his reputation, but his freedom. As I lay in bed that final night, listening to Eddie's peaceful breathing beside me, I thought about all the families who had been murdered so that the Castellano collection could exist. Their suffering was about to be acknowledged, their stories finally told, their stolen heritage returned to its rightful place. The anniversary celebration they had planned as my humiliation would become their reckoning. Tomorrow, 70 years of silence would end, and the dead would finally receive the justice they deserved. Saturday evening arrived with all the pageantry Eddie had orchestrated for what he believed would be my final humiliation. The romantic dinner at Rosewood Manor was everything he had promised: candlelight, champagne, the same table where he had proposed 5 years earlier. But as we sat across from each other in that elegant dining room, I could see the anticipation in his eyes, the barely controlled excitement of someone about to deliver what he thought would be the perfect, devastating blow. "Kendra," he began as dessert arrived, his voice taking on the practiced sincerity I had learned to recognize as his prelude to manipulation. "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage lately, about whether we're truly happy." I sipped my wine, watching him build toward his grand moment. "Oh? And what conclusions have you reached?" His confidence was palpable as he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing an envelope that he placed carefully beside my dessert plate. "I think we both deserve better. I think we both deserve to be with people who truly understand us." The envelope contained exactly what I had expected: divorce papers and a cold, calculated letter explaining his decision to leave me for Callie. He had even included photographs, apparently taken during their romantic getaways, as if visual evidence of their affair would somehow make his betrayal more palatable. "I know this is difficult," he continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "but Callie and I have found something real together. Something you and I lost somewhere along the way." I set down my wine glass and opened the envelope, reading through his carefully crafted justifications and legal demands with the calm detachment of someone who had been expecting this moment for months. The divorce settlement he proposed was insulting: minimal alimony, no claim to family assets, and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing the Castellano family's business affairs. "You seem to have thought of everything," I said finally, folding the papers and placing them back in the envelope. "Though I'm curious about this non-disclosure clause. What exactly are you afraid I might say about your family's business?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. "It's standard in high-profile divorces. We simply want to protect our privacy and maintain discretion about family matters." "Family matters," I repeated, tasting the words like wine. "Yes, I suppose there are quite a few family matters that would benefit from discretion." Eddie's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on with his script. "Callie is waiting in the car outside. We're leaving tonight for a weekend in Napa Valley. When we return on Monday, I'd appreciate it if you could have your personal belongings moved out of the house." The casual cruelty of his plan, abandoning me at our anniversary dinner while my sister waited outside like a getaway driver, would have been devastating under normal circumstances. But knowing what awaited them tomorrow morning transformed his betrayal into comedy. He was so focused on his small, petty victory that he couldn't see the tsunami approaching from behind. "That's quite a timeline," I said, signaling the waiter for our check. "Though I'm afraid your schedule might need some adjustments." "What do you mean?" I smiled, pulling out my own envelope, the one containing just a small sample of the evidence that would destroy his family's empire. "Well, for instance, you'll need to be back by 10 tomorrow morning for the private viewing I arranged with your mother. Several prominent collectors are coming to see the family collection, along with some very special guests." Eddie's confusion was evident. "What special guests?" "Holocaust survivors, actually." People whose family's artwork ended up in your collection through rather interesting circumstances. I slid the envelope across the table. You might want to take a look at this before you make any travel plans. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope and saw the first photograph, the Van Gogh from his family's gallery, alongside documentation of its theft from the murdered Rosenberg family. The color drained from his face as he realized what he was looking at. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "The same place I got documentation for 46 other pieces in your family's collection. It's amazing what you can discover when you apply forensic accounting skills to art provenance research." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Did you really think you could abandon someone who specializes in uncovering fraud without considering what she might have already discovered?" Eddie's carefully orchestrated evening was collapsing around him as the magnitude of his miscalculation became apparent. "Kendra, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. Your great-grandfather was a Nazi collaborator who helped steal art from Jewish families before they were murdered. Your grandfather laundered those stolen works through shell companies and forged documents. Your father continued the family business while building a reputation as a legitimate collector. And you," I paused, watching him struggle to process the implications. "You've spent our entire marriage knowing this truth, while using my expertise to maintain the illusion of legitimacy." The restaurant's ambient noise faded into background as Eddie grappled with the realization that his perfect plan had been turned against him. "What do you want?" "Justice," I said simply. "For the Rosenberg family, whose Van Gogh you display so proudly. For the Levy family, whose Renoir hangs in your dining room. For the dozens of families who were murdered so your great-grandfather could build his fortune on stolen art." Eddie's phone buzzed with a text from Callie, probably wondering why he was taking so long to complete what should have been a simple abandonment. The irony was perfect. While she waited outside expecting to begin their new life together, he was learning that his old life was about to be destroyed by crimes committed generations before his birth. "The FBI's art crime team has been very interested in my research," I continued, my voice maintaining its calm, conversational tone, "as have several international restitution organizations, Holocaust museums, and investigative journalists. It's remarkable how much attention a story like this generates when it's properly documented." "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" I smiled, standing and gathering my purse. "I suppose you'll find out tomorrow morning when Sarah Rosenberg Klein walks into your family's gallery and sees her murdered family's Van Gogh hanging on your wall. She's 92 years old, Eddie. She's been searching for that painting for 70 years, ever since the Nazis took it from her home in Amsterdam." I placed enough cash on the table to cover our dinner and headed toward the exit, leaving Eddie sitting alone with the photographs that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the restaurant's entrance, I paused and turned back. "Oh, and Eddie? You might want to call your lawyer tonight. All of your lawyers, actually. You're going to need them." Outside, I could see Callie waiting in Eddie's car, probably checking her makeup in the mirror and imagining their romantic weekend getaway. She had no idea that her lover was inside, having his entire world destroyed by evidence of war crimes committed before either of them was born. Tomorrow morning, they would both learn that some secrets are too heavy to stay buried forever, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The Castellano family's reckoning had finally arrived, and it would be more devastating than any of them could have imagined. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, the Chicago sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the weight of what was about to unfold. By 9:30, the Castellano estate was buzzing with activity, as caterers prepared for what Miranda believed would be a sophisticated viewing of their collection for Chicago's cultural elite. She had dressed impeccably for the occasion, a cream-colored suit that complemented the stolen Monet behind her, pearls that had probably once belonged to a murdered family, and the confident smile of someone who had no idea her world was about to collapse. I arrived early, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but actually to position myself for maximum dramatic effect. The manila envelope containing the complete evidence of the family's crimes sat on the conference table like a bomb, waiting to detonate. Additional copies were safely stored, with federal agents positioned around the estate, ready to prevent any attempts to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. Eddie and Callie had returned from their abbreviated romantic getaway around midnight, their plans clearly disrupted by the reality check I had delivered at dinner. Through the guest house windows, I could see Callie pacing nervously while Eddie made frantic phone calls to lawyers and family advisors. The confident couple who had expected to begin their new life together now looked like prisoners waiting for sentencing. John Sr. moved through the house with unusual agitation, checking and double-checking security systems and making cryptic calls about protecting family interests. Miranda busied herself with last-minute arrangements, but I could see the tension in her movements, the way she kept glancing toward the study where Eddie had undoubtedly shared at least some of what I had revealed the night before. Only Ash seemed genuinely unaware of the gathering storm. He wandered through the house in his typical casual manner, probably nursing a hangover and wondering why everyone seemed so tense about what should have been a routine social event. At exactly 10 o'clock, the first guests began arriving. Dr. Timothy Harrison from the Art Institute, accompanied by several board members who had known the Castellano family for decades. Museum directors from institutions across the city, drawn by the promise of viewing one of Chicago's most significant private collections. Art journalists whose presence would ensure that whatever story emerged would receive widespread coverage. But the most important arrivals came in a modest sedan that pulled up the circular drive at 10:15. Sarah Rosenberg Klein emerged slowly, assisted by Dr. Goldman from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. At 92, she moved with the careful dignity of someone carrying the weight of profound loss, but her eyes were sharp and determined as she approached the house where her family's stolen treasures had been displayed as trophies for decades. Behind her came three other survivors. Ruth Goldman, whose family's Rodin sculpture graced the Castellano garden. David Steinberg, whose grandfather's Picasso sketches hung in the guest bathroom. And Eva Rosenfeld, whose family's Degas painting had been admired by countless dinner party guests who had no idea they were looking at stolen Holocaust artifacts. Miranda greeted the growing crowd with her practiced social grace, introducing guests to one another and guiding them toward the main gallery, where champagne and hors d'oeuvre awaited. The stolen masterpieces glowed under carefully positioned lighting, each piece positioned to maximum advantage, completely unaware that they were about to be revealed as evidence of genocide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miranda announced as the last guests arrived, "welcome to our home and to what we consider one of Chicago's most significant private art collections. The Castellano family has been passionate collectors for 4 generations, and we're delighted to share these treasures with fellow art enthusiasts." That was my cue. I stepped forward, the manila envelope in my hands, and addressed the assembled crowd with the calm authority of someone about to deliver devastating news. "Thank you, Miranda. Before we begin the viewing, I'd like to introduce some very special guests who have traveled here today for a rather extraordinary reunion." I gestured toward Sarah Rosenberg Klein and the other survivors. These remarkable individuals are Holocaust survivors whose families own several of the pieces you're about to see. The room fell silent, confusion rippling through the crowd as the implications of my words began to sink in. Miranda's practiced smile faltered, while John Sr.'s face went ashen as he realized what was happening. "Sarah," I continued, turning toward the elderly woman whose dignity commanded the room's complete attention, "would you like to tell everyone about the Van Gogh hanging behind the Castellanos?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice strong despite her age as she spoke words that had been 70 years in the making. "That painting hung in my family's dining room in Amsterdam. I was 6 years old when the Nazis came for us. I watched from our neighbor's window as they loaded our belongings into trucks while my parents and grandparents were forced to kneel in the street with their hands behind their heads." The room was completely silent now, the weight of her testimony settling over the assembled guests like a shroud. Several people moved closer to examine the Van Gogh with new eyes, seeing not a beautiful artistic treasure, but evidence of one of history's greatest crimes. "My entire family was murdered at Sobibor," Sarah continued, her voice never wavering. "For 70 years I believed our treasures were lost forever. I never imagined they would be hanging in an American mansion, displayed as trophies by the very people who helped steal them." Miranda found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled panic. "I don't know what kind of cruel hoax this is, but these allegations are absolutely false. Our collection has been in the family for generations. Acquired through Salvatore Castiano's partnership with SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, I interrupted, opening the manila envelope and withdrawing the captured Nazi correspondence. Through a network that systematically looted Jewish collections across occupied Europe and shipped stolen art to American buyers who paid premium prices for pieces with, quote, discreet provenance. I began distributing photocopies of the documents to the stunned guests. Original Nazi letters discussing the acquisition of specific pieces, shipping manifests showing their transport to Chicago, financial records documenting payments for art stolen from murdered families. Dr. Harrison examined the documents with the careful attention of a scholar, his face growing pale as he recognized the implications. "My God," he whispered, "this is documented Nazi art theft. These pieces should have been returned to their families decades ago." John Sr. finally found his voice, his usual commanding presence reduced to desperate pleading. "These are fabrications, obvious forgeries designed to what?" I asked calmly. "To expose war crimes that should have been prosecuted generations ago, to return stolen art to the families who paid for it with their lives." I turned back to the crowd. "Every document you're seeing has been authenticated by Holocaust research organizations and federal investigators. The FBI's art crime team has been building cases based on this evidence for months." The mood in the room shifted from confusion to horror as the full scope of the Castellano family's crimes became apparent. These weren't just allegations or family disputes. They were documented war crimes with living witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed or discredited. Ruth Goldman stepped forward, pointing toward the garden where her family's Rodin sculpture stood among Miranda's prized roses. "My father died protecting that piece," she said, her voice carrying the weight of unspeakable loss. "The SS shot him in our front yard when he refused to tell them where we had hidden our collection. They found it anyway, and now it decorates the garden of his murderer's American partner." The room erupted in shocked whispers as the assembled guests, Chicago's cultural elite, realized they were witnessing the exposure of one of the largest collections of Nazi-looted art still in private hands. The scandal would rock not just the Castellano family, but the entire American art world that had willfully ignored uncomfortable questions about wartime acquisitions. Eddie stood frozen in the doorway, watching his family's carefully constructed empire crumble in real time as decades of hidden crimes were finally dragged into the light. The silence that followed Ruth Goldman's devastating testimony was broken by the sound of car doors slamming in the circular driveway. Through the tall windows, we could see black SUVs and unmarked sedans arriving in formation, their occupants moving with the purposeful efficiency of federal law enforcement. Agent Hendricks had timed the FBI's arrival perfectly, ensuring that the family's public humiliation would be immediately followed by legal consequences. Miranda's face went completely white as she watched Agent Hendricks and her team approach the front entrance, their badges clearly visible and their intent unmistakable. The assembled guests, Chicago's most prominent cultural figures, found themselves witnessing not just the exposure of war crimes, but the arrest of people they had considered friends and respected community members. "John Castellano Sr.," Agent Hendricks announced as she entered the gallery, her voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to receive stolen property, money laundering, and violating the National Stolen Property Act. Edward Castellano, you're also under arrest on similar charges." The room erupted in chaos as agents moved to secure the two men while other team members began photographing and cataloging evidence. Several guests moved toward the exits, clearly desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal, but found their paths blocked by additional agents who needed witness statements about what they had observed. John Sr. maintained his dignity even as handcuffs were placed on his wrists, but his eyes burned with rage as he looked at me across the crowded room. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice carrying a menace that would have terrified me just days earlier. "This family has protected you, supported you, treated you like a daughter. This is how you repay our generosity? Generosity." Sarah Rosenberg Klein's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Despite her 92 years, she moved toward John Sr. with the strength of someone finally confronting the people who had profited from her family's murder. "You call it generosity to steal art from families before they were sent to death camps? You call it generosity to build your fortune on Holocaust victims' suffering?" The elderly woman stood directly in front of the man who had spent his entire life benefiting from Nazi war crimes, her presence more powerful than any federal agent or legal document. "That Van Gogh you're so proud of? It hung in my grandmother's dining room. She would lift me up to touch the frame and tell me stories about the cypress trees reaching toward heaven. The last time I saw it was the morning they took us away, when your partner Klaus Weber was loading our belongings into trucks while my family knelt in the street." John Sr.'s composure finally cracked under the weight of her testimony. "That was a different time, different circumstances. We had nothing to do with what happened to your family. You had everything to do with it." Ruth Goldman interjected, moving to stand beside Sarah in a show of solidarity that represented decades of searching for justice. "Your grandfather paid SS officers to steal our art before our families were murdered. You've spent 70 years displaying our heritage as trophies, while we searched for any trace of what was taken from us." Eddie, who had been silent since the arrests began, finally found his voice as the full scope of his family's destruction became apparent. "Kendra, please, we can work something out. The divorce, the affair, none of that matters now. We're still married, we're still family." I looked at him with the calm detachment of someone watching a stranger. "Family? Eddie, you abandoned me at our anniversary dinner to run away with my sister while planning to leave me vulnerable to prosecution for crimes I knew nothing about. You used my expertise to legitimize stolen art while lying to me about everything your family had built their fortune on." "I was protecting you," he said desperately. "The less you knew, the safer you were. I thought if we divorced quietly, you could walk away without any legal complications." "Protecting me?" I laughed, the sound echoing off the gallery walls, lined with stolen masterpieces. "You were protecting yourself. You knew that if federal investigators discovered the truth about your collection, anyone with knowledge of the family business could face prosecution. Your abandonment wasn't liberation. It was cutting loose a potential liability." Miranda, who had been silent since the arrests began, finally exploded with the fury of someone watching a lifetime of careful construction collapse in minutes. "You ungrateful, vindictive little, this family made you. We gave you everything: status, wealth, connections, a lifestyle you could never have achieved on your own. And this is how you repay us." "You gave me lies," I replied calmly. "You gave me a life built on the graves of Holocaust victims. You made me complicit in concealing war crimes while pretending to be philanthropists and cultural preservationists." Dr. Harrison, who had been examining the Nazi documents with increasing horror, stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. "As a representative of the Art Institute, I want to assure everyone present that we had no knowledge of these pieces' true provenance. We will be conducting immediate reviews of any works we may have borrowed or displayed from the Castellano collection, and we will cooperate fully with restitution efforts." Other museum officials quickly followed suit, each eager to distance their institutions from the scandal while promising full cooperation with federal investigators. The art world's willful blindness to inconvenient questions about provenance was about to face a reckoning that would extend far beyond the Castellano family. Agent Hendricks approached me as her team continued securing evidence and taking statements. "Mrs. Castellano, we'll need you to come with us for a complete debriefing. Your cooperation has been invaluable, but we need to document everything you've discovered and ensure your safety during the investigation." "Safety?" Eddie asked desperately. "She's still my wife, still part of this family. What kind of danger could she possibly face?" Agent Hendricks fixed him with a look of professional contempt. "Mr. Castellano, your family has spent decades concealing evidence of war crimes and defrauding Holocaust survivors. When that kind of criminal enterprise is exposed, the people responsible sometimes take desperate measures to protect themselves. Your wife has just become the key witness in one of the largest art restitution cases in American history." As federal agents led John Sr. and Eddie toward the exit, I found myself standing among the Holocaust survivors whose courage had made this moment possible. Sarah Rosenberg Klein approached me, taking my hands in hers with the gentle strength of someone who had survived unimaginable tragedy. "Thank you," she said simply. For 70 years, I thought my family's story would never be told, that their murderers would never face consequences. You've given us something we thought was lost forever: justice." The weight of her gratitude was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. The performance was over. The secrets were revealed, and the dead could finally rest knowing their stories had been told, and their heritage would be returned to its rightful place. Through the windows, I could see news vans arriving as word of the arrests spread through Chicago's media networks. The Castellano scandal would dominate headlines for months, forcing America to confront its complicity in concealing Nazi war crimes and potentially triggering restitution claims that could affect hundreds of museums and private collectors. But in that moment, surrounded by survivors who had waited decades for justice, I felt only the profound satisfaction of knowing that 70 years of silence had finally ended. The weeks following the arrests unfolded like a carefully choreographed symphony of justice, each movement building upon the last, until the full scope of the Castellano family's crimes became impossible to deny or minimize. The FBI's art crime team worked with methodical precision, cataloging evidence and building cases that would stand up to the most aggressive legal challenges. Agent Hendricks kept me informed of their progress during regular debriefing sessions that served both to gather additional details about my discoveries and to ensure my safety as the investigation's key witness. "We've confirmed the authenticity of 47 pieces in the collection so far," she reported during one of our meetings. "The documentation you compiled has been corroborated by archives in 7 different countries, and we've identified living heirs for 31 of the families whose art was stolen." The media coverage was relentless and global. The Washington Post's exposé, published 3 days after the arrests, dominated front pages around the world, with its detailed account of how American art collectors had knowingly profited from Nazi war crimes for over 70 years. The story included photographs of the stolen masterpieces alongside documentation of their theft, creating a visual narrative that made the family's crimes impossible to dismiss. "Chicago Art Dynasty built on Holocaust blood money," read the headline in the Chicago Tribune. The New York Times followed with an investigation into other American collections that might harbor similar secrets, while European newspapers explored the historical context of Nazi art theft networks and their American collaborators. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Federal prosecutors had built such a comprehensive case that plea negotiations began within weeks of the arrests. John Sr. and Eddie faced charges carrying potential sentences of up to 40 years in federal prison, along with forfeiture of assets connected to their criminal enterprise, essentially the entire Castellano fortune. Miranda, who had initially escaped arrest, found herself facing charges as well, when investigators discovered her active role in maintaining false provenance documents and laundering money through charity organizations. Her decades of philanthropic work, once the foundation of her social standing, was revealed to be an elaborate money laundering operation designed to legitimize wealth stolen from Holocaust victims. Only Ash was spared criminal charges, though his inheritance evaporated along with the family's seized assets. In a moment of surprising maturity, he publicly disavowed his family's crimes and offered to cooperate with restitution efforts. "I had no idea about our collection's true history," he said in a statement released through his attorney. "If I had known that our wealth was built on the suffering of Holocaust victims, I would never have accepted a penny of it." The international implications were staggering. European governments that had been pursuing art restitution cases for decades suddenly had access to documentation that could resolve hundreds of missing works. Museums around the world began reviewing their collections for pieces that might have passed through the Castellano network, while auction houses faced scrutiny for their role in legitimizing stolen art through fabricated provenance documents. Dr. Goldman coordinated the restitution process with the efficiency of someone who had waited her entire career for such an opportunity. "This case is establishing precedents that will reshape how art restitution claims are handled," she explained during a press conference. "For too long, the burden of proof has been on survivors and their families to demonstrate that their heritage was stolen. The Castellano documentation reverses that burden, forcing current owners to prove their pieces weren't acquired through Nazi networks." The survivors themselves became powerful advocates for broader restitution efforts. Sarah Rosenberg Klein, despite her advanced age, testified before Congress about the need for stronger laws protecting Holocaust survivors' property rights. Her appearance in the Senate chamber, describing how American collectors had displayed her family's stolen Van Gogh while her relatives' graves remained unmarked in Poland, moved even the most skeptical legislators to support expanded restitution legislation. Ruth Goldman established a foundation dedicated to tracking Nazi-looted art still held in American collections. The Castellano case proves that these crimes didn't end with the Holocaust, she said during the foundation's inaugural event. They continued for decades in American living rooms and galleries, hidden behind fabricated stories and willful blindness. For me personally, the investigation period brought both vindication and exhaustion. Federal protection was necessary as legal proceedings continued, but it also meant living under constant scrutiny, while my former life was dissected by investigators, lawyers, and journalists. Every conversation I'd had with the Castellano family was analyzed for evidence. Every social event we'd attended was reviewed for potential witnesses or accomplices. The divorce proceedings became a minor footnote to the larger criminal cases. Eddie's attempts to salvage some portion of his inheritance were futile once federal asset forfeiture laws took effect. The mansion, the art collection, the business holdings, everything connected to the family's criminal enterprise was seized and would eventually be liquidated to fund restitution payments to survivors and their families. Callie, caught between her relationship with Eddie and the magnitude of his family's crimes, chose to distance herself from the scandal entirely. She moved back to Ohio within weeks of the arrests, abandoning her interior design business and her dreams of joining Chicago's social elite. Our relationship, already damaged by her affair, couldn't survive the weight of everything that had been revealed. As the investigation concluded and the family prepared for sentencing, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me from a naive young woman in love to the key witness in one of the largest art restitution cases in history. The papers that had silenced the Castellano family weren't just evidence of crime, they were testament to the power of truth to prevail over decades of carefully constructed lies. 6 months after that devastating anniversary weekend, I stood in the same gallery where I had exposed the Castellano family's crimes, but the space had been transformed beyond recognition. The stolen masterpieces were gone, replaced by empty walls that somehow felt more honest than they ever had when adorned with Nazi loot. Federal marshals had removed the last pieces the day before, carefully crating them for return to museums and families around the world. The sentencing had been swift and comprehensive. John Sr. received 35 years in federal prison, a virtual life sentence for a man in his 70s. Eddie was sentenced to 28 years, his dreams of freedom with Callie replaced by the reality of growing old behind bars. Miranda received 15 years, her decades of philanthropic reputation unable to shield her from the consequences of money-laundering war crimes. The estate itself had been sold to pay restitution claims, purchased by a tech entrepreneur who planned to convert it into a Holocaust education center. The irony was perfect. The mansion built on stolen Jewish heritage would become a place where future generations would learn about the crimes that had funded its construction. I had purchased a small apartment in downtown Chicago, far from the suburban grandeur I had briefly called home. My consulting practice had expanded dramatically, as the Castellano case established my reputation as an expert in art fraud investigation. Museums and private collectors around the world sought my services to verify the provenance of their holdings, particularly pieces acquired during or after World War II. But the most meaningful work came through the foundation I had established with Sarah Rosenberg Klein and the other survivors. The Stolen Heritage Recovery Project used the investigative techniques I had developed to track Nazi-looted art still held in American collections. Every successful restitution case felt like a small victory for justice. Delayed, but not denied. Sarah had become like a grandmother to me, our shared experience of confronting the Castellano family creating a bond that transcended our age difference. Despite being in her 90s, she remained active in the Foundation's work, traveling to speak at schools and museums about the importance of understanding art's human stories, not just its aesthetic value. "You gave my family their voice back," she told me during one of our weekly lunches. "For 70 years, our story was silence. Now it's justice. The Van Gogh that had hung in the Castellano Gallery was returned to her family's foundation, which chose to loan it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Visitors could now read the painting's true story. Not a romantic tale of grateful refugees, but the testimony of a murdered family whose cultural heritage had survived to bear witness to their destruction. Ruth Goldman's Rodin sculpture was returned to her family trust and placed in a memorial garden in Vienna, where her father had died protecting it from Nazi thieves. Eva Rosenfeld's Degas was donated to a museum in Berlin, displayed alongside documentation of her family's fate and the decades-long journey that had brought their treasure home. The ripple effects of the case continued to reshape the art world. Congress passed new legislation strengthening restitution laws and requiring enhanced provenance research for any artwork changing hands. Museums implemented more rigorous authentication procedures, while auction houses faced increased scrutiny from federal regulators. Perhaps most importantly, the willful blindness that had allowed stolen art to hide in plain sight for decades was finally being challenged. The comfortable fiction that uncomfortable questions about ownership were best left unasked had been shattered by the undeniable evidence of what such willful ignorance could conceal. On this final day in the empty mansion, as I walked through rooms that had once displayed stolen masterpieces, I thought about Eddie's abandonment letter and how perfectly his timing had served justice. His attempt to humiliate me had freed me to pursue a truth that had been hidden for 3 generations. The anniversary dinner where he had planned to destroy my life had instead become the beginning of the most meaningful work I had ever done. His betrayal had transformed me from an unwitting accomplice to an instrument of justice for families who had waited 70 years to reclaim their heritage. As I locked the mansion's front door for the final time, I felt not sadness but profound satisfaction. The papers that had silenced the Castellano family would continue speaking for the dead, ensuring that their stories would never again be forgotten or dismissed. Justice had finally arrived, carried in a manila envelope that contained not just evidence of crime, but testament to the enduring power of truth. Some secrets are too heavy to stay buried forever, and some victims too important to remain silent. The dead had found their voice, and through their recovered heritage, they would continue speaking for generations to come. The Castellano family's empire of lies had fallen, but from its ashes rose something far more valuable: the restored dignity of families who had died believing their stories would never be told. Their stories would now echo through history, ensuring that the crimes committed against them would never be forgotten and never be repeated. In the end, truth had proven more powerful than decades of careful deception, and justice had prevailed over the silence that had protected war criminals for far too long. The anniversary of my abandonment had become the anniversary of their liberation. And in that transformation, both the living and the dead had finally found peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.